Hello, my stars, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Basil, and today I will be reading Show Us Who You Are, Chapter 2, The Perpetrators, by Amika Libri. Now, here's the summary. An epic presentation needs some preparations. Luckily, Izuku knows enough people who'd help him. Even though that means telling them, especially Aizawa, about his former quirk status. After Izuku had told Shinsou about his ideas, and he felt a little giddy at the thought that they could maybe become friends now that the purple-haired teen knew, they worked out a detailed plan on how they were going to put it to practice. They drew up a schedule for the following week, and Izuku sent messages to several different people whose help they would need. Then, they looked up a few free apps they could use and decided who did what. It took them quite some time, but after about 2 hours, they were done and ready for the week. Thursday. The most difficult thing to do this week followed already on Thursday. To speak with Aizawa. Izuku was downright scared to tell his teacher, but he knew he needed to tell him at least part of the truth. Actually, he was relieved that the definition of false negatives only said that they were people with a quirk and a quirkless body. No mention of quirk factors, so technically Izuku wouldn't be lying to the hero, even though he couldn't tell the whole truth. So after their last lesson on Thursday, Shinsou and he approached their homeroom teacher. Aizawa was shuffling a few pieces of paper on his podium, but he looked up when his students paused in front of him. He arched his eyebrow questioningly. "What is it, problem children?" he drawled. Izuku was pretty sure that black-haired hero expected there to be a problem with the presentation. And there kind of was, but surely not what Aizawa thought it would be. After their talk yesterday, Izuku and Shinsou found out that they actually got along flawlessly, with the both of them being victims of discrimination. So, if Aizawa expected them to want to change their pair-up on their next topic, he was wrong. Izuku wrung his hands together and twisted his messed-up fingers until they hurt. But he needed the pain to ground himself. He was scared what Aizawa would say, scared what he would do. What if he didn't want to have a formerly quirkless person in his class? What if he said he couldn't do it? What if he expelled him because he was too much of a burden? Because he was weak and stupid and under-evolved and just a worthless Deku? No, he thought. No, he couldn't do that. Eraserhead fights quirkless most of the time. He wouldn't expel me for not having a quirk. A while ago, he wouldn't. So, he took a deep breath, ignored the slightly worried look he got from Shinsou at his side, and met his teacher's dark eyes. His face was completely expressionless, except for a raised eyebrow. We need to talk to you in private, please," he stammered, internally wincing because his stutter hadn't been that bad while talking to Aizawa in a while. The underground hero stared at him for a second. Then he nodded slowly. "Alright." He pushed a stack of papers into his capture weapon. And how did they completely vanish without falling out? Was there some kind of magical pocket in his scarf? And led the way out of the room, but he stopped right outside the door. "Todoroki, did you need something too?" "No, sir. I'm just here for Midoriya." It's alright, Sensei. I asked him to. He's emotional support," Shinsou interrupted casually, and Izuku sent him a grateful look. Aizawa sighed and rubbed his eyes, murmuring something unintelligible under his breath. Then he sighed again, and gestured for the students to follow him. While he turned and led the way to his office, Shouto was immediately at Izuku's side, and the backs of their hands brushed against each other. The dual-haired teen knew how hard this talk would be for his friend, cough, or rather, crush, cough. And Izuku would be eternally grateful for his support. He didn't know how else he would stand his teacher's intense and probably disappointed stare. A few minutes later, they arrived at one of the private meeting rooms. It was not the same one Izuku usually met with All Might, but it looked completely similar. A small table between two couches, A little kitchenette with a tea cooker in the corner and a large plant adding a little touch of something living. Aizawa took a seat on the couch, facing the door, while Izuku and Shinsou sat on the one opposite. Shouto followed soon after, carrying a cup of fresh tea, which he handed to Izuku. The green-haired boy slung his hands around the mug and felt the warmth seep into his slightly aching hands, and easing the pain. "Thanks," he muttered lowly, and Shouto blushed a little. "Ugh," said Shinsou. "You two are sickeningly sweet. Gross." Just a day ago, such a comment would have hit Izuku hard and made Shouto stand up and position himself between the other boys. But after their talk yesterday, and a talk Izuku had with Shouto this morning before school, they both just shrugged and smiled a little embarrassingly. "Alright, what did you want to talk about?" Sensei interrupted abruptly. Immediately, the mood in the room was tense. Shouto lay a hand on Izuku's arm and squeezed it briefly, encouragingly. Once again, Izuku took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on his hands, still curled around the mug. Then he looked up to his teacher and said, "I am a false negative. I was quirkless until I was 15. The first time I used my quirk was when I smashed the 0-pointer during the entrance exam." He exhaled, his eyes turning down again, and his whole body shaking with nerves. Here it was, the moment that would decide about his future. The moment he could get expelled, and all his dreams could get crushed. And he couldn't stand to see his teacher's reaction. But he could feel those dark eyes on him, could feel Shoto's grip on his arm tighten, and Shinsou at his side straighten up. Aizawa began, but broke off before he tried again. "You are a false negative." Izuku nodded without looking up. "And you were quirkless most of your life. You didn't have a quirk before UA?" He nodded again, and Aizawa sighed. "Problem child." "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, but most people don't react well to me not having a quirk and was scared, and please don't expel me." "Slow down, Midoriya," Sensei said at the time, as Shouto took the mug out of his hands and clasped his own hands, one warm and one cold, around Izuku's. "It's all right, Izuku. You're all right. Take a deep breath, please. Just breathe with me." And that was when Izuku noticed that he indeed wasn't breathing properly. Tears started to pull in his eyes, obscuring his vision. He tried to do as he was told and match Shoto's breathing, but it took him a few minutes until he felt like there was actually some air reaching his lungs, and how the tears streamed down his cheeks. "Good job, Midoriya," came Aizawa's voice from across the table, and Izuku was so startled by it that he looked up at the man on an instinct. The black-haired hero looked impassive on the first glance, but Izuku had learned to be more attentive, to look out for every little tell in a person's face. And so he saw the worry in the tightness of his jaw, and the compassion in these deep, dark eyes. And suddenly, his whole body relaxed, because there was no mistaking that expression. Aizawa understood. He understood. Tears of relief fell from his eyes and wetted his cheeks anew. "I'm sorry," he said again, not knowing exactly what he was apologizing. "It's alright, problem child. You were scared, and I guess you don't really have a good track record with teachers. Not when you were quirkless." Izuku nodded, sniffling, and Shouto rubbed his back soothingly with his warm hand. "Okay, then I want to make one thing clear," Aizawa said intensely. "You are not in trouble. I'm not going to expel you. You have proven that you belong into the hero course, and this has nothing to do with your quirk. It wouldn't have been anything to do with your lack of quirk if you were still quirkless." Izuku stared at him, completely taken aback by these words. Did Sensei mean... Being a hero is not about quirks. It's about your determination and your hard work, about your wish to help others. It's about your heart, and you, Midoriya, have a heart of a hero. There's no doubt about that. I'm sure, even quirkless, you would have found a way to be a hero. "Oh." Izuku whispered, "Oh." And he broke down crying again. I've always wanted, nobody ever believed me. He couldn't finish a single one of his sentences, but the three others in the room all got the message. He had needed to hear that so bad. He had needed someone to believe in him, not in his quirk. And even though All Might did believe in him now, there was still the memory of a rooftop and an answer that shattered every dream he had. Thank you, the greenette finally said, and there was so much emotion behind those two simple words that it took the other's breath away. Aizawa was the first one to find words again. No need to thank me for telling the truth, and I want to say that I'm sorry. Why? What? Why? You're the best teacher I've ever had. Well, that's just sad, but I really do need to apologize. When I saw you break all your bones while using your quirk, I assumed you were just lazy or arrogant and didn't bother to train your quirk. That you thought having a strong quirk was enough, even without putting any effort in. But after I got to know you better, I should have seen that this wasn't the case. You're probably the most hard-working student I've ever had. I should have noticed that something wasn't adding up and talked to you. Then you may have gained control over your quirk before it gave you chronic pain. But I just overlooked all my concerns for that. I'm very, very sorry. And he bowed his head low to Izuku in front of other students. Izuku's brain short-circuited, and he needed a moment to reboot. But then, the situation finally sank in, and the teen waved his hands around frantically. It's all right, really, you don't need to do that. I do. He does. Shouto! What? He should have helped you, and he didn't. That's a valid reason to apologize, and to do better. He added while glaring at his teacher, his hand laying on Izuku's arm again in a protective gesture. Aizawa took his animosity in stride and nodded. I will do better. Then you should make sure that Midoriya isn't paired up with Bakugou again in training. Hizoshi spoke up without giving any further explanation, but the underground hero didn't need any more explanation judging by the way his eyes widened and then closed, an almost pained expression on his usually stoic face. You're not rivals, he murmured. Was he your bully? Nobody ever told him to stop. He still should have known it wasn't right to use his quirk on you until he left scars. Shouto deadpanned. Scars? Shinsou stared at Izuku, and there was barely concealed rage in his bright purple eyes. Whatever you plan, I'm obligated to tell you shouldn't do it, so please talk about it somewhere I can't hear it. Aizawa interrupted him, somehow managing to sound even more exhausted than usual and unbelievably angry at the same time. You don't have to do anything, please, Izuku begged. We'll talk about this again later, problem child. But right now, am I right in assuming that your presentation about quirkless discrimination would reveal your condition to the rest of the class? Yes, that's why I wanted to tell you before. And I'm grateful that you did. What have you planned to say? In the next few minutes, Izuku and Shinsou explained their plan and what they would need for it. Izuku recounted all the things that happened to him and that he wanted to tell the class. The teacher listened without showing any reaction, but in the end he agreed to help them as much as they needed. When they left, Izuku felt lighter, like he hadn't in a very long time. Actually, like he hadn't since his diagnosis. Although the thought of telling the class about him having been quirkless made his stomach churn, he knew he'd at least have Shouto, Shinsou, and Aizawa-sensei who would support him. He could do this. The next day, Aizawa held Izuku back and informed him that he scheduled regular meetings for the boy with the school counselor, Hound Dog, and if Nedzu already worked on burning down a school district, sipping tea and cackling, well, nobody would blame him. He was a hero, after all, and there was a boy who needed justice. Friday. During lunch on Friday, Izuku and Shinsou took their bento boxes and excused themselves from their friends. Shinsou insisted that they were only Izuku's friends and he had just dragged into their group without his consent. To walk down to the labs of the support course. When they neared the door, they already heard manically laughter and desperate shouting of Power Loader, and then an explosion. A rather small one, however, since the door to the lab still stood when they arrived, so Mei couldn't have gone full out. They didn't bother to knock, and Izuku opened the large door and peeked inside, clearing his throat to draw attention. Power Loader stopped in the middle of his scolding and looked over to the door, while Mei, covered in soot from head to toe, bounced happily and completely unbothered over to the door. 10 million! She screamed. Hi, Mei. Hello, Mr. Power Loader. Izuku greeted back and entered the room, allowing Shinsou to follow him. Do you have what I asked for from you? He wanted to know, looking at the pink-haired girl expectantly. Mei's grin widened and she ran over to a workbench covered in metal scraps and blueprints. After throwing half of the papers to the ground, she found 3 metal objects and brought them over. Power Loader had switched to his desk in the meantime and kept an eye on his personal problem child, clearly fearing she might blow something else up. Here you have it, 10 million! So, short instruction, she continued, to explain each of the devices she had for them. They were just some simple little items, and Mei was a little disappointed that there was no need for her to add some weapons or anything like that. But, well, the customer was king. Thank you, Mei. Izuku beamed when she finished. That's exactly what we need. Right, Shinsou? Yeah, thanks. The taller teen drawled, his face as bored as ever. Inside, however, he cheered a little bit. Now they had at least the right equipment to make their presentation. Saturday. They met Aizawa-sensei at the gate, since they needed a teacher to accompany them off campus. Izuku and Shinsou had packed Mei's devices together, and with a black-haired hero, made their way through the streets and alleys of Musutafu. Their first stop was a district in a darker part of the city. Aizawa's face remained impassive as he sat on the fire escape and watched Izuku first walk, then sprint through a dark alley and nearly slam into the wall when he was too fast around the corner. Hitoshi was hot on his heels and purposely slamming into one of the dumpsters just to make some noise. The underground hero shook his head at his 2 students in fond exasperation. At least they gave his assignment really their all. Their second stop was a tall building in a slightly better part of the city. When they reached it, the sun was nearly setting, and Izuku stared upwards along the building with a strange expression in his eyes. You're good, problem child? Aizawa asked. Izuku flinched a little, but then he smiled and nodded. Yes, I'm fine, just memories. What kind of memories? Izuku lowered his head for a moment. He wasn't even sure if he wanted to answer at all, but then he decided that he could trust his teacher with this. I considered it here. Jumping, I mean. A shocked gasp came from Shinsou, and Aizawa frowned worriedly. We don't have to do this here, the gruff underground hero said, surprisingly soft, but Izuku waved his hands around widely and replied, It was just a very bad day. I'm much better now. You still shouldn't have been in this situation in the first place. Shinsou grumbled, but he sighed and followed his green-haired classmate into the building. And Izuku was better. He really was. The memory of the day he met All Might and was left on the very roof still hurt him sometimes, but didn't crush him anymore. He had friends now, and he knew that they would be sad if he wasn't here anymore. Still, he felt warmth bubble up in his chest as he felt his teacher's capture weapon wrapping itself strongly and tight around his waist when he climbed over the railing. Even more when Shinsou held his hand out to help him climb back to the safe side. Sunday. This time, they met in Shinsou's room, and Izuku couldn't help but notice that the purple teen was far more relaxed here than in his own room. If it was because it was a familiar environment, or because there wasn't a dozen of All Might smiling at him, he couldn't distinguish. But it didn't particularly matter anyway. Are you ready? Shinsou asked, and Izuku hurriedly concentrated back on his laptop and the microphone he plugged in via micro USB. Yes, I'm good. Are you? Shinsou pulled up the mask from his hero costume and nodded. Let's go, he said in Iida's voice, and the two boys got to work. Monday. On Monday after school, Izuku and Shinsou left the classroom together with the so-called Deku Squad. Monday. On Monday after school, Izuku and Shinsou left the classroom together with the so-called Deku Squad. Hey! What about we ask Kaminari if we could use his console to play a little? Ochako suggested with a wide smile. But not before we're done our homework, Tenya insisted, chopping the air with his right arm. Yeah, of course, class rep. The bubbly girl answered with a fond roll of her eyes, gaining her a small giggle from Suyu. But afterwards, we should play something. Sorry, guys, Izuku said, only a little hesitantly. Shinsou and I can't join you. We've still got some things to do for our presentation at Wednesday. What? You have to work more? Ochako cried out, and Suyu tapped her finger to her lips and added, You're really putting a lot of work into that assignment. It is very commendable to take your schoolwork seriously, Tenya shouted, chopping the air again. I have to admit that Koda and me didn't invest quite as much time as you did. We all should take you as an example. Yeah, whatever. Shinsou drawled. We have to go now. Izuku nodded and smiled briefly at his friends. See you later! The others gave their greetings as well and left. Ochako and Suyu planning an epic tournament in Mario Kart, while Shouto walked behind them silently, and Tenya reminding them of their homework again. Izuku shook his head fondly at their antics. Then he turned and followed Shinsou to the classroom of 1C. Upon entering the room, they're greeted with two wide smiles and an enthusiastic, Hey, little listener! Hello, Yamada-sensei. Hi, Mirio! Izuku greeted, smiling equally wide. Oh, dear gods, Shinsou muttered and resigned himself of the fate of being surrounded by sunshine people for the next few hours. I should have brought sunglasses. Izuku shot him a curious look, but then he turned back to the two blondes in front of them. Thank you so much for helping us out. No problems, little listener. How could I not help two so hard-working students? Gotta show a eraser how it's done, right? Ya dig? Yeah, I'm always glad to help my little kohai, Mirio added, and then he frowned a little in confusion. But what exactly do we need to do? Well, Izuku explained, as I said, we're doing a presentation on quirkless discrimination, and, he fiddled with his hands and lowered his eyes to the floor. I was quirkless until recently. He heard the two blondes gasp, but he carried on. And I wanted to show how it was, how I was treated. Oh, little listener! President Mike's voice was laced with compassion and sorrow. He, just like Aizawa, knew immediately what Izuku meant with how I was treated. It can't have been nice or kind. The world was cruel to the quirkless, and the statistics spoke volumes about how bad they really had it. What do you mean until recently? Mirio asked, his own demeanor a lot more subdued than before. I walked into the UA entrance exam without a quirk, and left with one that shattered my bones. The greenette replied in a monotone voice that clashed with the wobbly smile on his face. It was something. Oh my gods! Yamada cried out before he quickly pressed a hand to his mouth to hold his quirk. When he had full control over his voice again, he said softly, That actually explains a lot. And it makes you even more impressive, Mirio added, his happy smile back on his face. You think so? Absolutely. I mean, you've had your quirk for not even a year and still keeping up with the toughest hero course in Japan. How's that not impressive, little kohai? Izuku sputtered something unintelligible until Shinsou interrupted him. Alright, we should get started. He pulled two papers out from his bag, handing each blonde one of them. This is a short description of what we need you to do. They both read the instructions, and soon after they started, first in the classroom, then in the halls, at some point, Mirio texted his friends Nijiri and Tamaki. After the Shihasakai raid, they all decided that Izuku should use their first names, and they helped them out too. About 2 hours later, they had all they needed, and Izuku could add Present Mike and the Big Three to the list of people who still supported after knowing about his former quirklessness. When they said their goodbyes, Mirio demanded that they tell him about how it went. If they give you a hard time about being a false negative, just tell me. We're work study buddies. I'll always have your back, okay? Izuku just nodded with tears in his eyes, as Mirio clapped a rather surprised Shinsou on the back, and left with another little wave, his friends in tow. Not only him. You can always come to me or Aizawa, you dig, little listener? Then Present Mike's eyes and voice softened. I'm so very sorry you had to go through all of that. And I'm so proud of you, to stay strong like that. I'm so glad you're here. He smiled, and Izuku smiled back, through his now streaming tears. Tuesday. They were almost ready. The presentation slides were nearly done. They only had to add the materials they gained yesterday, with the help of Present Mike and the Big Three. There was only one thing left. When we look at the seating charts, the ones most in the middle are Kaminari, Kirishima, Jiro, and Sero. Izuku said, Yes, but did you ever sit in the middle? Like, the outcasts are usually at the back or on the side, aren't they? Shinsou argued, I never sat in the middle of the room in my whole school career. Well, that's the difference between the outcasts and the victims. The green-haired teen replied quietly, a faraway look in his eyes. My desk was always surrounded by others. That made it easier for my bullies to reach me, and I couldn't really evade whatever they did because I had no way to dodge. Shinsou breathed out a puff of air and deadpanned. Well, shit, I never thought I'd be glad that my classmates were afraid of me, but here I am. Sorry. The purple teen sighed heavily, and he slapped Izuku's forearms lightly with the back of his hand. There's nothing to apologize about. You've done nothing wrong. Now, back to the seating chart. If you want to take someone in the middle, it should rather be the second row than the third. We'll have to go back to the front anyway. Izuku nodded. That leaves Kaminari or Jiro. I'd rather go with Kaminari, actually. He's more carefree. Shinsou nodded in agreement. So, that's how they found themselves holding Kaminari back when they returned from the lunch, pulling him into an empty toilet. The blonde looked pretty confused as to why he was basically kidnapped by two of his classmates. But when they explained to him what they needed for his help for, he agreed easily. Just remember, no word to no one. Understood? Yeah, Shinsou, jeez, no need to look at me like that. My lips are sealed. He made a motion like he zipped his lips, locked them, and threw away the key over his shoulder. We count on you, Kaminari. Izuku chirped from the side, and the blonde immediately knew that he couldn't disappoint that smile. Tough luck, since he wasn't actually the best at keeping secrets. But he should be able to manage for one day. If one of his friends asked, he could just tell them it was a secret and he didn't know much about it himself. Which was true, actually, since he really didn't know what exactly the other two planned. Just that it was run by and accepted by Aizawa, and that he shouldn't take anything personal, even though he should act to do so. Great. Now he was really curious. What the hell had these two planned? Even more so when they weren't even friends a week ago. Well, Kaminari internally shrugged. He would see tomorrow. Wednesday. The day of the presentation arrived. Izuku felt his stomach churn, and he could barely eat anything at lunch. It was only Shouto's cold presence at his left side that calmed him down enough to at least take a few bites of his lunch. And then their laws and ethics lesson came around, and he swallowed his nerves. They would be the last group to go. They had everything planned out. They were ready. He closed his eyes and took some deep, measured breaths. When he opened his eyes again, he caught Sensei looking at him, and his teacher gave him a barely noticeable nod that calmed him down more than he would have thought. Right, Aizawa-sensei was on his side, so were Yamada-sensei, the big three, and Shinsou, and of course, Shouto. Whatever would happen this afternoon, he would not be alone. No, he would not be alone. But would he be lonelier? Alright, my stars, that is the end of that chapter. The next chapter is the actual presentation, so stay tuned. And I'm so sorry this chapter has come out so late. If you guys seen the post I posted onto my page, that kind of explains some things. And also, I was dreading this chapter because, I was not bothered recording it. During the recording process, I had to stop so many times. God, my stutter was horrible and I couldn't get the words right. But finally, I got it done, and here it is. I hope you enjoy it. And I hope to see you in the next one, which I hope will come out quicker than this one did. Anyway, bye my stars.